Hi, welcome to Talkin' Sunday Readings. My name is Ann Carter. I am here again with Pastor Richard Stadler and Father Chuck Carter. And we are discussing the readings for the fifth Sunday in Lent. We are coming down to the end of it again. The season comes and goes rather quickly. The Old Testament lesson is from the book of Genesis, chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. The New Testament epistle is the book of Romans, chapter 8, verses 6 through 11. The Gospel is John, chapter 11, verses 1 through 45.
A reading from Genesis. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son, Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in a distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided."
The Old Testament lesson is the command of God to Abraham to offer his son Isaac in sacrifice. God told Abraham to take his son to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Now, God knew how important Isaac was to Abraham because he says so. "Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer him." And Abraham did. He got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men, took Isaac, and they set off. On the 3rd day, Abram looked up, he saw the place, they went up, and Isaac, there's just so many unanswered questions here of how old was Isaac, what did he know about what was going on? We don't quite know. He appears not to have protested, but Abraham had the knife. He's going to sacrifice, and God said, "No, don't do this. I don't want human sacrifice. What I want is what you've just given me, and that is obedience, no matter what. You didn't know what I had in mind, but you've proved that you love me more. More than this earthly dynasty that I promised you, more than the land of Canaan that I promised you. You're walking with me, and that's what's most important." And Abraham looked up, saw a ram, and sacrificed the ram. And all of this happened at Moriah, which traditionally is believed to be Jerusalem, where the temple is. And if anybody wants to know why is Jerusalem so important, why is Temple Mount so important, it's because there are lots of traditions that go right back to that spot. It's also fascinating. Abram is in Beersheba, or he goes back to Beersheba, which is in the southern portion. So he is going north into Canaan. So while God promised him all of this land, he's not even living in it at this time. But he has confidence that God's going to provide everything. And his faith is vindicated.
Right.
Because everything is provided for him. Everything is taken care of.
This text is an amazing reminder of Jesus. There's so many things buried in this, or embedded in this text, that he looks up on the third day, and that's the day that he's supposed to offer his son as a sacrifice. And it's on the third day that Jesus arises from his sacrifice and is alive on the resurrection of Easter. On the way up the hill, twice it says the Father and the Son are going together. And you have to believe that when Jesus is climbing Mount Calvary, he and the Father are tight. And then it says he laid the wood on the back of Isaac, and Jesus had the cross of wood laid on his back. Abraham says to the two boys who are with him, the boy and I will go up the hill and worship, and then we will come back. He doesn't say, I will come back. No. So he's confident, as Hebrews will tell us.
So
Hebrews interprets that.
So my note was Abraham lying? Was he deceiving himself, or he was confident that that's what was going to happen?
He was confident that God would either, if he had to go through with the sacrifice, he would raise his son from the dead, because that's what Hebrews tells us. Hebrews interprets this. Or that somehow God would provide for it. And even that term provide, we got Jehovah Jireh is a great song that's built on that terminology. In Hebrew, it literally means see to it. See. It doesn't mean provide, but the first and root meaning of the word that's used there is see. And we've got an English idiom exactly the same way. If I see to it, that means I'm going to get it done. And so they said this, when his son says, he's smart enough. In fact, Jewish tradition says he's 37 years old.
Yes.
Because Isaac's 37. Because at the end of this story, the next story is the death of his mother at age 127. And he was born when she was 90.
Okay.
And so that makes him 37. And in fact, Jewish tradition links this story and says the devil, in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, they make up the explanation that the devil goes to Sarah, tells her that her son has been killed by her husband, and she has a heart attack and dies. And then that comes the next story. But that's all fine fascination, but it's not in the text of Scripture. But what is fascinating is that we don't hear a thing about Sarah in this whole story. And that's why some commentators have suggested he left early in the morning before he had to explain to her where he was going.
Yeah, because it's a 3-day journey. He didn't necessarily have to leave that early in the morning.
But he does. And so it's just fascinating when you see this. And then when he comes back home, she's in Hebron. He doesn't go back to Hebron.
He goes back
to hug his wife. He goes to where Hagar and Ishmael are living in Beersheba.
Isn't that interesting?
I mean, this is a soap opera of the first degree. And maybe if you'd come this close to losing one of your sons, you would go to check on your other son, And so
it might put things into perspective.
Yeah, well, every time a parent hears about some parent who has lost a child, you have a tendency to go give your kid a hug. And I think maybe that was the human dimension of this story, is that Abraham went and checked in with Ishmael.
What's so fascinating too is so much of the narrative around Abraham is based upon the child of promise. And this child is given. They laugh at God. Sarah laughs, and this is where Isaac gets his name from. That such a thing could even be possible. It's where Ishmael comes from, because they believe that God is being a little too slow with this promised child. So take Hagar, and as soon as the kid is there, well, now I'm really going to put this to the test.
Well, yeah, and he doesn't argue about it. You would think he would debate with God and say, hey, wait a minute, God, you said that this is the child of promise, and now I'm supposed to offer him as a burnt offering, and you can't translate that word any other way. It was to slaughter the animal and burn it up. So, but he just is a man of faith.
Right.
And he trusts that, okay, God, if you're asking the impossible of me, I'll do it, and I know you'll figure it out. You'll see to it, you know, and that's why they named the place.
God will provide.
God will provide. You know? It's just a fascinating story.
So if we turn to Romans, Romans 8, verses 6 through 11, we have the teaching around.
A reading from Romans. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For this reason the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed it cannot. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also, through his Spirit that dwells in you.
The Spirit, the flesh, the death and resurrection. It's all up in here in what Paul is talking about here. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For this reason, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. I think had Abraham, for instance, we'll just use him as a reference here since it's fresh, had he set his mind on the flesh in this instance, well, this is my son, this is my inheritance will pass on to him. God has promised so much through him. He might not have listened to God's command in that moment, and then who knows what would have happened after that, right?
That's a good connection to make.
Sure.
I think
Thanks.
so.
Hey.
Yeah.
Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh. This is the transformation, the new life in Jesus Christ. You are not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit. And this, I think, is so important. I think it encapsulates the essence of the gospel in a lot of ways. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also, through the Spirit that dwells in you. I think that is as much of an encapsulation of the gospel as, say, John 3:16 is even, because it's about the new life. It's about resurrection, the relationship between the flesh and the Spirit. Paul is talking about all of it right here in just a few verses.
And this is a wonderful anticipation of Easter. We're
Yes.
only 2 weeks away from Easter this Sunday. And so this story and the story of the resurrection of Isaac, so to speak, he's coming alive on the mountain and not having to die, it reinforces that theme that we're going to also hear in the gospel lesson, that life comes out of the midst of death. And even though the surrounding is full of death and decay, yet there's resurrection.
And there's such a wonderful note of hope for us, that it is the same Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead that dwells in us too.
Yeah.
That's power.
Yeah.
That's power. Yeah.
That the same, the mystery by which Christ rose from the dead is also the mystery within us, the Spirit. You know.
Right.
And we can't quantify it. We can't, study it, analyze it scientifically, but we know its effects.
Yeah.
And it's an effect that has been demonstrated to us in Christ, and because of Christ, it is something in which we now hope as well. So.
And I think it gives us hope that in this life, that struggle between spirit and flesh is going to be constant until the day we die. We won't be delivered from it until we die. And then in heaven, we will not have a sinful flesh. We'll have nothing but holiness. But in this life, there's a constant struggle. And so get ready for it, but have this hope. The Spirit who is in Christ and raised him from the dead is also in you now to equip you for that struggle.
Yeah. So,
And that takes us to the
John.
gospel lesson.
The Holy Gospel according to John. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was merely referring to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." Now when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was laying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him.
The story of raising of Lazarus,
There you
and
go.
it looks like he's not. Jesus is not concerned about one of his best friends. The scriptures identify him as a friend, and he's on the other side of the Jordan River, and word comes to him that his friend is sick. The sisters, Mary and Martha, have sent the message. Maybe it took a day for the message to get there. He hangs around for 2 more days before he leaves. In the meantime, he tells the disciples he's just sleeping. And they said, well, then why bother go see him? And then he finally says he's dead. They don't catch on. And so they go, and
He's dead, Jim.
and they get there, and he's been dead for 4 days, and they bury the body on the same day it dies. So it's been in the tomb for 4 days. And by this time, the body is starting to disfigure because there's no embalming or any of that stuff. And Martha comes out to him, and he has this wonderful conversation with her that we get to hear, where he identifies himself as the resurrection and the life, and he assures her that he who believes in me will live even though he dies.
Yeah.
And then she affirms the fact that there was a belief in the resurrection before the resurrection of Jesus. And she says, I know he will rise on the last day. So there were Jews in those days who believed in a resurrection on the last day. Some critics have tried to say there wasn't such a belief, but that's not true. And then Jesus says, actually the truth is, he who believes in me will never really die. And I just love that verse. I mean, that's why these verses are often used at funerals as a reassurance of the resurrection that's going to occur for the dead Christian and the believer. And so he then simply says, open up the grave. And Martha says,
Ever the practical.
yeah, it's kind of smelly. It's going to be bad. And there was a tradition among the Jews that the soul hovered over the body for 3 days before it went off to Sheol, to the realm of the dead. And so there are stories of rabbis who apparently prayed people back to life within that 3-day period. But once you get to the 4th day, and that may explain why Jesus waited till the 4th day intentionally, it was impossible. And he does the impossible. And he does it just by his word. He says, Lazarus, come forth. And some critics have said, well, why does he even bother calling him by name? And the answer that one Lutheran minister gave to those critics was, well, if he hadn't said Lazarus, everybody dead in the hill would have come out of their graves, And so there's just a wonderful affirmation of the power of Jesus and anticipation of what he will do on Easter. And what's really fascinating, we don't see it in this story, but after this story, in the next chapter, we're told that the enemies of Jesus put out a contract on Jesus. This really ramps up their hostility to him, but they also put a contract out on Lazarus. So they're going to kill the evidence because too many people are believing in Jesus now that they've seen this. I mean, this defies all of their traditions. So it's a really a powerful reading to anticipate Easter and the resurrection.
It's the resurrection of Lazarus, and of course, in John's Gospel, the incident with the money changers takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have that incident take place just prior to his crucifixion.
Right.
And so either one, we have at least 2 things that kind of cement Jesus' fate. That it's either the resurrection of Lazarus, and then maybe Jesus just doubles down with the overturning of the money changers' tables. But it certainly fleshes out for us this picture of what Jesus was doing and why he got in so much trouble.
Well, and I think he intentionally did the cleansing of the temple on both the beginning and the end as bookends of his
Sure.
ministry,
Yeah.
because there's a prophecy in the last chapter verse of Zechariah's prophecy that says that when the time of Messiah comes, there will be no merchants in the house of God. Now, sometimes it's translated Canaanite, sometimes it's translated merchant, but I think merchant is the translation. And what Jesus is signaling to people is the Messianic age has come upon you. He does it at the beginning of his ministry and at the end of the ministry to really hammer home that point. And some critics of the Bible have said, well, they can't get it straight. Was it at the beginning or was it at the end? The point is that's not a contradiction.
Yeah.
He did it both times.
Sure.
And he wasn't just interested in cleaning up corruption in the temple, because if so, he is the biggest failure, because within 3 years they're back to the same old thing. But what he's doing is giving a message, a visual message. And here, this is a powerful visual message. So, anything else you want to throw in for people to listen to?
Well,
Or
one
four?
just last quick. Verse 37, some of them said, could he who opened the eyes of the blind not have kept this man from dying?
Yeah.
So they're still blind. If
Yeah.
he's talking about, because it's chapter 2 before that Jesus has healed this blind man, and these people were witnesses to it. Now they've come, and now in sarcasm and condescension, Jesus, and
Well,
they
and
still don't believe.
both Mary and Martha say that to Jesus. Had you been here, our brother would not have died. And so you wonder, are they trying to
Or they
critiquing him?
just knew that he could have prevented it.
Yeah, and he had that
There's
confidence.
sarcasm in this
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
I don't see in Mary
no.
and Martha.
No. So, well, thank you for joining us for this conversation. We hope that you'll find it worthwhile, and we, if you like it, indicate you like it, and encourage your friends and share it on your media. And thank you to Tim Carter for preparing these videos every week. Have a great week.